Good evening, everybody. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the menstrual cycle, but more from a point of view of how our energies are affected. So the Chinese medicine point of view. And then I'm also going to go through some exercises and some movements and maybe show some points and areas on the body that you can use at different phases of the cycle. So first of all, as we're talking about Chinese medicine, probably most of you have heard of the 12 meridians, which are amazing. The 12 meridians we have are, because I'll talk about this to start with, because they do very much influence how our menstrual cycle is, and I'll explain why in a minute. But with the 12 meridians, the first one is lung and our breath. Lung and large intestine is also then the letting go, and it's very much related to our skin and how we take things in from the outer world, especially through our breath and especially through the space around us, and that will influence our menstrual cycle. And then the next meridians are spleen and stomach, and that's really a lot about what we eat, what we take in, so food. And I think most people are aware that different types of food that we eat, firstly, it may vary what we're drawn to at different phases of our menstrual cycle. And secondly, some foods may actually, although we're drawn to them, may not be that helpful, like having too much sugar, things like that. That can have a more of an adverse effect. But we also have to remember, in Chinese medicine, stomach and spleen isn't just food, it's also emotional nourishment. So it's actually also about the quality of our relationships. And we probably also have observed that if we're feeling stressed or unsupported, then that affects our menstrual cycle. And then the food key and the air key make blood. And blood is a very important energy in Chinese medicine, because it's not just the blood that flows through our blood vessels, it's also an energy of nourishment. But menstrual blood is considered a little bit different, because menstrual blood is much more related to essentially our DNA, our genetics, our epigenome, and that's the domain of the extraordinary vessels, which I'll talk about more. Menstrual blood is seen as more like heavenly blood and a movement of essence, which I think is already really lovely, that they see, the lining of the endometrium, yes, it's being nourished with blood, but it's a different quality of blood. And it's this blood that will eventually nourish a baby if we do conceive. It's also this blood that when we stop menstruating, the Chinese say that this special heavenly blood, or an expression of essence, which I'll explain, is there because we need to nourish ourselves more. So the perimenopause, that was one of the questions I was asked at the beginning, is, for me, it's a time when it's very important that we start to value ourselves more and how we can nourish ourselves, whether or not we've had children, but especially if we've had children and we've given a lot of our energy to our children. The perimenopause is saying, hang on, you now need to switch around your energies and look more after yourself. And even if you haven't had children, it's a time in our age, around about the age of 50, where our energies, our essence, I'll talk about that, is starting to run lower, and we need to start to look after ourselves more. So we need to support our overall blood, our air key, our food key. And then after, the other 12 meridians are the heart and small intestine to make the blood, and then the kidney and the bladder. Kidney is about purification, taking this special energy to nourish us, bladder elimination, and then the triple heater and heart protector pericardium, how we get this warmth and energy moving around our body. And then the wood, the gallbladder and the liver is a lot movement and quite dynamic, and it's quite a yang energy. And you may have heard of the 5 seasons, the pairs of the elements. The meridians are related to elements, and the wood, the last one, is really wood, spring, a yang energy. And then that moves into, and then it's a different cycle. The cycle of the seasons is a slightly different expression and order of the 12 meridians than I've just described. But all of that to say that as menstruating women or women after menstruation, we're living in a world which is constantly influencing our basic energy. And that's the world of the 5 seasons, the elements, and the 12 meridians. the food we eat, the air we breathe, the people that are surrounding us. But the base of the changes that happen in the menstrual cycle and in the menopause come from a deeper energy. I mean, in Western terms or modern terms, we could say it's hormonal changes. The ancient Chinese didn't know about the hormones, but they did understand that there were certain changes that happened in the body, and they talked about another cycle of energy, because the 12 meridians is really the 24-hour cycle, our day-to-day energy. And they talk about another energy which is called our essence, which I referred to before, which is basically said to be an energy that we receive at the moment of conception. So you could say our essence is really our DNA. And our essence, as we now know, actually only relatively recently in modern science, but the ancient Chinese also understood that what we're born with, the egg and the sperm, or the energy of our two ancestral lines, from the moment of conception is being influenced by the outer world. And that initial outer world is the world of our mother's body, because we don't have a direct contact with the outer world. Obviously, everything's filtered through our mother. The blood that we receive ultimately through the placenta comes through our mother. We're not directly in relation with the outer world, but our essence or our DNA is already being modified in the womb. And then they talk about, so they don't use words like DNA and epigenome, they talk about pre-heavenescence, which is before conception, and then post-heavenescence, which is once we start forming our physical body. Some people say it's after birth, but I don't see it like that. And with modern epigenetics, we understand it's influencing us in the womb. And this is, we could say, kind of our internal body clock and our internal energy, that yes, it's being modified by the outer world, but clearly there's already a strong basis in our DNA. And so the age at which we start menstruating, the age at which we stop menstruating, all of this is also influenced by the outer world, but this internal clock, which is our essence. In Chinese medicine, that's called our Jing, and it's said to flow in 7-year cycles for women and 8-year cycles for men. And so we have a time of our lives when we're fertile, and that's the menstrual cycle, usually from about 12 to 50, but it varies, as we know. And an interesting thing that shows the changes in the outer world that affect everybody is that the age of onset of menstruation is much younger now than it was in primitive societies, or more agricultural, maybe primitive isn't a good word, agricultural societies, or cultures that were more connected to the land and the rhythms of the land, and didn't have some chemicals and toxins and plastics and all the things that we have in the world now. But interesting, the age of the menopause hasn't really changed, so that's quite interesting. Now, the other thing is that with the 12 meridians that I just described, there's not a brain meridian or a womb meridian. And that's because there's a whole other set of meridians or energies called the extraordinary vessels, which regulate this connection between the brain and the womb and more, but I'll keep it to that connection because that's essentially also the hormonal changes which regulate the menstrual cycle. And so if we're going to affect this more inner clock and the changes in the essence through our lives, then we need to be working with the extraordinary vessels. And so if you're working, one of the questions that was at the beginning was how, if there are irregularities in the menstrual cycle, or heavy bleeding, or spotting, or anemia, or long cycles. For the ancient Chinese, so on this menstrual chart that we have, which is more Western view, is 28 days. Although we could say, so this is an average cycle, as you know, how many women do have 28-day cycles? Some women do. And it is interesting that the 28-day cycle is the lunar cycle. And we know that in traditional cultures, especially when women spend a lot of time together, because we also see this in modern cultures. When women spend a lot of time together, the menstrual cycle starts to harmonize. This is the interaction with the outer world. But also in more traditional societies, more women's cycles would be in harmony with the moon cycles, and there was known as a red moon cycle, which is menstruation on the full moon, the red moon cycle, and the white moon cycle is ovulation on the white moon, on the full moon, the white moon cycle. So the lunar cycle. But one question was, cycles too long? It may just be that is the natural cycle, to have it a bit too long, a bit longer, even up to 33, 35 days. The ancient Chinese weren't so much concerned about the length of the cycle, that it has to be 28 days, because everybody is actually a bit different. As long as it was irregular, they were more interested in the regularity of it. And as far as I understand, they also understood that it can change during our lifetime. And also that it takes time for a regular menstrual cycle to establish. We know now, and I'm sure the ancient Chinese also knew that, but a lot of it hasn't been written about that much, because it was more women's cycles issues. If the cycle is too short, then it may mean that the egg hasn't had sufficient time to mature, and then there may not be ovulation, which then has a knock-on impact. So too short a cycle may be more of a problem than too long a cycle that's much shorter than 28 days. But so within, but we have to have something as a base. So we have this 28-day cycle. And some people sort of break it down to spring, summer, autumn, winter, the 5 elements. It's not really quite as simple as that, because we don't have 4 distinct phases like the 4 seasons that are the same. But I would say that you can see aspects of the seasons coming through at different times. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens in the cycle, and how it affects the extraordinary vessels, and how it affects movement of yin and yang within the body. But we always have to remember, sometimes people, so yes, yang and yin, there's always some yin and some yang. You can't have one without the other. In our modern minds, we often separate yin and yang. Oh, it's either yin or yang. The reality is it's always a bit of a mix of yin and yang. In terms of movements of yang in the cycle, so yang being a more clearing, liberating, outward kind of movement, like it is like spring, like all the new shoots bursting through. It is also a bit like giving birth, energies coming out of our body. So we can say, of course, menstruation, there's a strong outer movement, a strong yang movement that initiates menstruation and then helps the blood to release. But there's also not such a strong yang movement, but a movement of yang around ovulation, because ovulation is also the egg being released. That's a movement outwards. That's considered a yang movement. So if you're working with the 12 meridians, we often talk about liver or gallbladder energy. If we're working with the extraordinary vessels, there's actually liver and gallbladder points in all of the extraordinary vessels, and there are 8 of them, and there are 4 that are more yin and 4 that are more yang. So when it's the yang phase of a cycle, we'd want to work more with the yang vessels to get that yang energy moving. But the yang energy can only move because there's a strong yin supporting it. So I'll try and mention some of the extraordinary vessels, but my next Zoom will be more on the extraordinary vessels, and I have other videos on the extraordinary vessels more in detail. But I now want to just get to this cyclical movement of energy, our internal clock that's flowing from about 12 to 50 years. But some women always have the same length cycle throughout that whole time, but I'd say it's fairly unusual. It's more of a sense to settle when we're in our early 20s, and it can change depending on what's going on in our lives. But there are the basic stages, and I will start with, but again, a bit like yin and yang, there's a couple of different things happening in the woman's body at any given time. So if we take the first day of the cycle, it's often called, is often when we bleed, because that's the release of the blood of the last cycle. So it's the end of one cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. But our body isn't just releasing the blood. So there is this yang movement out, this release, which is the girdle vessel, which I'll go through the points, I think, in exercise form. I'll just name the vessels for now. So there's the girdle vessel, especially that releases, along with all the other yang vessels. And but at the same time, there's an egg, or there's actually about 5 to 10 eggs in a natural cycle that start to enter their final phase of maturation. It's not actually completely the final phase. The final phase of maturation of the egg is when it's fertilized, but the final stage leading to ovulation, and as we know, only 1 or maybe 2 eggs will be released in one cycle. Usually it's 1 egg. So already as we're releasing that which is more yang, there's a yin movement happening in the egg building up its strength. We could say that's more yin, and it builds up its strength to ovulation. And then at ovulation, hopefully it has built up its strength. So the building up for the egg, that's a yin movement, and then it needs the follicle which has been holding it to release it. So there's that yang movement. And then the bit that I think a lot of people gloss over is that once the egg is released, whether it's fertilized or not, the follicle that held the egg becomes the corpus luteum, and that's why the second half of the cycle is called the luteal phase. In many more modern textbooks, there's only 2 halves of the cycle: the follicular phase, which is the follicle maturing to release the egg, and then the luteal phase, which is named after the follicle, which is now transformed into a corpus luteum, which actually, a yellow body, grows, keeps growing. So I think sometimes people forget about that. After ovulation, we still have a building of yin energy. Essentially, we could even say a building of blood, which is regulated by one of the powerful, extraordinary vessels called the penetrating vessel. The blood has been building up to ovulation, but the blood continues to build for another week or so after ovulation. That week, 10 days, is in fact a fairly immutable length part of the cycle if there's ovulation, because the corpus luteum, the yellow body, that's its life cycle, unless it gets a signal from an egg which is implanting in the womb. That's when the HCG levels start to go up, and it's a hormonal signal back to the corpus luteum to carry on for about another 10 weeks while the placenta's building, which takes over the relay from the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is essentially a temporary endocrine structure. It's the corpus luteum that helps the increase of levels of progesterone in the second part of the cycle, but actually also estrogen remains quite high, and we have another pregnancy hormone, relaxin. And if it continues, then those 3 hormones and other hormones will continue to increase: estrogen, progesterone, relaxin. So I think that's a bit of the cycle that often people forget, that the week after ovulation, we're still building up the energies, because we're now nourishing this corpus luteum, which also signals to the lining of the womb to keep building. So the lining of the womb builds for another week. So it's actually at its thickest. Lining of the womb, remember, that's blood energy linked with yin, linked with the penetrating vessel. So the yin keeps building after ovulation, because you need strong yin to then support a strong movement of yang to have a nice strong movement to release the blood. We need the yang. So if there's no implantation, the corpus luteum starts to degenerate, and it's through the degeneration of the corpus luteum that the hormonal levels, progesterone, estrogen and relaxin, drop, and that hormonally signals to release the lining of the womb. And that, in energetic terms, is a movement of yang. That's before the bleeding, and that takes us back around to day 1 again. So in terms of the woman's body, the lining of the womb is building after the end of menstruation. So that's depending on the cycle, about day 4 or day 5. Someone talked about spotting, that kind of showing that the body's, the yin is weak because it's still being released. The yin needs to stay in the body to build up. So any kind of spotting, any lengthy periods, actually heavy bleeding, is that the body's not able to hold in the blood. So it's actually a weakness of yin, not usually a sign of yang being stuck, unless there are things like fibroids or cysts. So heavy bleeding can be a weakness of yin, a weakness of blood, a weakness of the penetrating vessel. And it just flops out. So it's not necessarily strong yang, but it could be stagnation of yang. So you have to really see. But of course, heavy bleeding is going to deplete our blood energy, and then heavy bleeding can cause things like anemia, but also in Chinese terms just cause weakness of energy, weakness of yin, weakness of blood. And so that's a sign to really nourish the blood. So I also like to think about the kind of more gifts of each of those cycles, and how they prepare us for other phases of our lives. So with this, if we start actually from the degeneration of the corpus luteum, which in a 28-day cycle is around about day 21 to 24, so a week to 4 days before menstruation, before the first blood loss. And I think that's a phase of the cycle that women are often aware of. Some women can be quite tired, some women can be quite scatty. There's a big shift because with the corpus luteum at 24 days, or 21 to 24 days, it's its strongest, it's the most yin. And that's the most yin phase. And also to say that from ovulation to the peak growth of the corpus luteum, the week to 10 days, is the same whether the egg is fertilized or not, because the body has to get ready. It doesn't know that the egg has been fertilized until it implants in the lining of the uterus. That's the first signal that the body's like, oh, okay, implantation, I carry on the corpus luteum. No implantation, corpus luteum just dies. So that's the same whether we're pregnant or not, because sometimes people think, oh, after ovulation, then the egg dies within 24 hours, then I'm not pregnant, then my body gets ready for a period. No, it's actually another week. It keeps going another week to 10 days in case there's a fertilized egg, because how does it know that the egg is fertilized or not? It needs to have some signal. So in this phase, it's still between ovulation and the dying of the corpus luteum, we could say, our body is still building energy. It's still building yin. So we really need to support the yin pretty much all the way through the cycle. Well, at any stage, if the yin is weak, we need to support the yin. But certainly the yin building up is very much from after menstruation until the corpus luteum, and then that yang movement for menstruation. So this yang movement is, in terms of bigger phases of our lives, is releasing, opening up our body to the outer world, to free something, to let go of something. And as in that freeing and letting go, we release ourselves a bit from day-to-day life, and we're more open to space, and therefore it offers an opportunity for transformation. So I like to call this whole phase, from the dying of the corpus luteum to the end of menstruation, liberation and transformation. Other phases in our life, well, it's preparing us potentially for giving birth, because it's very similar energies. We've built up all the blood, we've got the placenta, the baby, we've been nourishing for 9 months, and then we need to shift and go much more into the yang and be able to give birth. So we need the strong yin to support the yang. In the perimenopause, we don't necessarily ovulate in each cycle. So our body's having to get ready for not having this clearing aspect. And so That's why I feel often in the perimenopause and the postmenopause, women get more sensitive about what they're taking into their body because they're less able to free it. This could be food, it could be how they're breathing, how they're moving, how they're exercising, but it could also be toxic relationships, toxic other people in our life, stress, all of that. And then we haven't got that force to free it and transform. And then after we've opened up, so that's very much a yang movement, then we bleed if it's the menstrual cycle. Oh, also, yes, and then we're quite empty after bleeding. This is the most, the least yin, or the least blood that we have during the menstrual cycle at the end of menstruation when we stop bleeding. So we would expect the energies to be at their lowest, but of course it's all relative. So if basically our energy is strong, we might not feel exhausted at the end of our period. But if basically our energy is weak, or if our basic energy is weak, we'll be really tired. That's the time we're likely to be most tired. But we would hope that that energy picks up quite quickly, because if it doesn't, we haven't built up enough strong energy for ovulation, for that surge of yang at ovulation. So that phase, the second part of the follicular phase after we're bleeding, it's really important that our energies are building up. And so I call this phase, regeneration. We need to regenerate our energies. We need to support this egg that's maturing. We need to be building up the lining of the womb, the endometrium. So we're building up blood in our body, penetrating vessels getting stronger, and then that will help with ovulation. But if our energies are weak, our blood is weak, then we might not actually build up much energy, and ovulation itself might be quite tiring, or we might not actually have the energy to mature the egg and to ovulate. And then we get sort of a very sluggish energy and not a full release around ovulation. And I feel that that can maybe cause issues with the follicles and cysts on the ovaries. It's definitely going to create a stagnation of energy in the womb and specifically in the ovaries, because you're not getting that kind of clearing out. And sometimes the egg isn't completely released, and that can be a reason why you get cysts building up. So it's really important we have this clearing out. So that's also a liberation, but I like to call that as a manifestation. It's the first stage of the egg. We've released the egg, or we've released an aspect of ourselves out into the world, and it needs extra support. We need another energy to come in to support it. That other energy in the menstrual cycle is the sperm, and the sperm creates the final phase of maturation of the egg. Then the egg can carry on its journey, hopefully down the fallopian tube to implant in the uterus, and then it will tell the corpus luteum to carry on working. So you can see that after the egg has been released, we still need the penetrating vessel. The blood energy is still increasing. The lining of the endometrium is still increasing. So we still need to be nourishing ourselves. But it's probably the phase in our cycle for most women. Our energy is at its strongest, in fact, after ovulation. For about a week or so after ovulation, we have quite a strong yin, although it's a little bit inward because it is that essentially the first week of pregnancy. So we still need to be nourishing ourselves. It's not like ovulation happens, then we think, oh, the egg dies and I just carry on, I can be yang. It's actually quite important to think of that week as we still need to nourish ourselves. We're still giving blood to the lining of the endometrium. Our blood, our penetrating vessel is being used. And so we still need to nourish ourselves. And then we get this surge in the releasing and liberating phases with the dropping of the pregnancy hormones. I've talked for quite a long time, so I think maybe we'll experience some of that. And as we experience the different movements, it's just to say that if there are any problems within the cycle, don't necessarily look at where in the cycle the problem is. If there's an issue with ovulation, it's probably because there's been a weakness in the bit of cycle before. And if there's an issue with menstruation, it's because there hasn't been sufficient nourishment. If you see what I mean, you can't just look at where the problem is, but look back and see, well, is there too much yin or too much yang? Is the person exhausted? Is the person like just being too outwards that they can't have enough yin? And so that might become a bit clearer as I go through the different phases with the extraordinary vessels and with some practical work. So for that, I'm just going to change the settings so that I can move a little bit. So this will be a moment where if you want to clear a bit of space to do some exercise, if you have a ball, it might be good to get a ball or a cushion or something like that. So give me one moment and I'll just change the settings. Great. So I think let's start, as we've been sitting, let's start with some yang movements. So there's this lovely vessel called the girdle vessel, which the top part is our ribs, and it's coming all the way down to our perineum like a girdle that has an underneath. And it can get quite stuck in the sacrum, but also it's influenced by our breath. So you might, in fact, want to just release under your ribs. So as you breathe out, put your fingers under your ribs and then maybe lean over and release your breath. Breathing in and breathing out, release your ribs. And as you come to your 11th rib, there's a really important point here. 11th rib called liver 13. So it's a liver, it's a yang energy point, wood. But it also supports the spleen, which is earth. So if you hold that point, it really helps to regulate the energy in the girdle vessel, the energy of left and right. The center is spleen. It's quite a centering movement. And also it both nourishes the yin to then release. So the other part of the girdle vessel when we're releasing and moving is just in front of the anterior superior iliac spine. There's 2 points, gallbladder points. That's also wood energy. That can really help to move things along. Remember I said wood in the 12 meridians, it's the most dynamic, so it can help move things. So that's quite a good releasing point for helping things move. I mean, yes, this isn't the womb, but the girdle vessel connects with the womb and the ovaries, and holding these 2 points can help release here as well. So the 11th rib is more about supporting the yin and the blood, and this one just behind. So feel the anterior superior iliac spine, and if you put your fingers there, if you feel the bone, it's just each side. But if you're just feeling the area and circling around with a figure of 8, that just helps the yang to release. Also on the back, all our sacral points, you might actually want to do a little bit of what we call doing, tapping along the sacral points. That they're on the bladder meridian, but they're part of the girdle vessel. So the extraordinary vessels basically exist before the 12 meridians. So they're made up of points on lots of the different meridians because they regulate the meridian. So tapping our sacrum is really good for releasing. Tapping all around. That's more the yang, the back and the sides of the body. And then the front is more gathering. So remember, we need the yin to release the yang. If you want to do something a bit more vigorous, start spiraling on your heel, but also releasing your arms, because we are releasing our womb, clearing our womb. But in doing that, that's blood. Blood relates to our heart. So if you put your hands on your heart, these are branches of the penetrating vessel, the sea of blood. They're kidney points along 2 thumb widths from each side of the midline, and then they come into the armpit, which is a heart point. Basically, I see this as the inner wings of our heart. So when we're pregnant or when we're building up our blood, our heart's more anchored inside. But when we release our blood, our heart also tends to release. So this is the liberation and transforming. We're also opening our heart into space. And then we have bigger wings, they're the linking vessels, and our shoulders. So we can also start to open our arms into space. And this is the transformation part, that we, for a moment in our monthly cycle, we're a bit more in the space. We're a bit more open. In traditional societies, women might have more visions at this time. We get a bigger picture. Often in the rest of our cycle, we might be coming along and we're building up our yin, and we're a bit almost too anchored to the earth. And then we have this few days in the month where we can open up. We can really see the big picture of our lives, and we may have different perspective on our lives. So you can even do quite vigorous turning, really releasing the hips and releasing the heart. It's a time to let go of what you no longer need. It's also preparing us, if we do have children, to give birth. We can do it the other side, often the other side difficult. So also, yeah, in pregnancy, this wouldn't be a very good movement, but women can give birth standing up. This release, because obviously in birth, we're giving more. We're releasing more blood, and the baby and the placenta. Another way, if we're getting a bit tired, we can release by leaning on a ball. So women in labour often use balls and may even give birth on a ball. It's actually much better for supporting that movement of yang energy. You can lift up a leg. So all this releasing, now this is what women in the menopause don't have. They're not releasing blood in the same kind of way. So it's actually really important in the perimenopause and the menopause, because in the perimenopause we don't necessarily ovulate with each cycle, therefore we're not releasing each month. Therefore, we need to be careful about what we take in, because we don't have the same physical capacity to release. Therefore, not only is it more important to be careful of what we're taking in, but we need to make sure we are really moving our bodies. And in modern culture, a lot of women are just sitting too much. So this whole area is very stagnant. But if we're tired, especially maybe towards the end of our bleeding, or even the end of birth, although giving birth is obviously, you can't give birth sitting on a ball, but if you're tired in birth or getting tired in the menstrual cycle, just sitting on a ball can be quite nice. But also making a connection with the pubic bone and the heart, the pubic bone, the womb, and we connect our womb and our pubic bone. And we're also sitting on the ball, we're having to constantly change our position. We can't be totally yin, can we? Because if we just slept, we'd probably fall off the ball. So we are a little bit alert. We're not as yang as when we're standing. So we need to we're constantly moving between the yin and the yang. And this is what we're doing with our feet, with our heels. There's the stepping vessels, which actually help us move between the yin and the yang. As we're walking, it's about finding a rhythm. If we're sitting, we're still constantly adjusting. But also the last points are the corner of our eyes, bladder 1. So if you open your eyes when you're sitting, you've probably had your eyes open, but now if you close them, of course you go much more into the yin. So I always like to say with these vessels, just in the blink of an eye, you can switch between yin and yang. And during them, at the end of the menstrual phase, probably women do want to be more relaxing and making sure that they're getting plenty of rest, because at the end, this is the time when our blood is the most depleted, when our penetrating vessel is the most depleted. We need to eat, but we also need to rest and just be in a much more yin space. So closing our eyes and resting. And then we need to build up our energy. So this is, first, we need to gather it in. So lying down is quite a good way, even in the fetal position, even crossing our arms over our chest, is a good way of gathering back in our energy, because our heart has opened with the blood, but also our pelvis is open. So first we probably need to rest, and maybe in the first couple of days after menstruation, even just really focus a bit more on gathering in the girdle vessel, gathering it back into the midline. And so we might want to put our hands, cross our hands, so we have our hands with our heart opening, but we can cross our hands, basically connecting with the lateral borders of our recti muscles, and with the out breath really gathering in. Because we first need to gather in our heart and gather in our womb, and then we can start to build the energy in the yin, and especially the penetrating vessel. So it can be actually quite nice to also just be in the child's pose, because that way we're really connecting to the earth, and then we can rest. This is the yin part of our body, is the front of our body, so we can rest our body on the floor or maybe over a bolster and really gather in and regenerate at the same time. And different women are going to need different amount of times to build the energy back up. But if the energy is basically strong in the yin and the penetrating vessel, that may only be a day or two. But this phase is also very important because it prepares us eventually for afterbirth or the postnatal period. That's one of my passions, because I believe that most women don't get enough rest postnatally. In most traditional cultures, a minimum was a month, but in ancient China, they would say it's really important for a whole year after having a baby to really take time in this gathering in and regeneration phase. So holding your baby, really taking lots of time, especially in the first weeks being at home, gathering in, and then really looking after yourself fully for the whole of the first year. And unfortunately, modern cultures don't value that enough. And I actually believe that creates a longer term depletion of our yin and of our blood. The ancient Chinese certainly said that as well. They said if you don't rest enough and rebuild our essence, we can rebuild our essence by really nourishing ourselves and really gathering in. But if we don't do that, we're going to have a weakness on some level for the rest of our lives. I'm not quite as pessimistic as that, but it's certainly, if we don't rest enough postnatally, then it's going to cause a weakness. And we have to build up our energy even more at some other point. And I think that some other point in modern societies is often only when we get to the perimenopause and we start to feel really exhausted because you've just been, living on weak, we haven't built up our blood enough, we haven't built up our resources enough. Because if we do build up our resources enough in the menstrual cycle, we get to ovulation. So this first surge of yang energy, which is kind of a little bit like a lighter version of the transformation preparing for menstruation. I like to have the ball as a sort of representation of the egg. But again, this is a more of an internal release, an internal or more intimate opening of the heart. And of course, in the menstrual cycle, the egg wants to reach another phase of maturation. So it wants to have a sperm that it can take new energy, because this manifestation, we need a new energy from somewhere outside ourselves, the sperm, to give energy to the egg so that she can carry on developing into a baby or becoming something else. But if the egg isn't fertilized, then she'll die quite quickly. So this is a time when we might be more intimate, feel more sexual, but also just feel more creative. The egg could also symbolize a project or a desire that we have, and that we want something else from outside. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. It could be new friends or a new environment or something else. So that's a focus I often say around ovulation. What else do you feel you need in your life that can help nourish you so that you can move on in your life? That's the manifestation of what do I actually want to come in to nourish me, not just the egg. In the bigger sense picture, that's what it is. I haven't really talked about men because in an hour it's hard to cover everything, but men have they don't have the same menstrual cycle, but there are times in men's life when they're more open in a more intimate way, when they want to manifest, but also they may need also to bring things into their lives. And then you get the building up. This is also building and giving energy to the corpus luteum, which carries on nourishing, building up the lining in the womb, or something that is being nourished from outside. And then if the egg isn't fertilized and doesn't implant, after a week or so, the corpus luteum starts to degenerate, and then our hormones drop, progesterone, estrogen, relaxin. So the energy drops, and in fact, the lining of the womb already starts to contract. So we could say the blood energy, or the yin, gets a little bit less as the corpus luteum degenerates. But hopefully there's still enough energy that we can have then this yang movement of release. So talking about men energy of release and transformation, I talked about the sacredness, I think, of the menstrual blood, unless that was in the French one, but menstrual blood is considered sacred, but also in traditional cultures, semen was considered sacred. So the equivalent for men is the sperm, obviously, the egg, and ejaculation and opening. And again, then we come back to the girdle vessel and opening of the girdle vessel. So those are the movements. Sometimes with the opening of the girdle vessel, there's a point in the top of the shoulder, another gallbladder point, trapezius, that can really help move things out, which can also be used during our ovulation. For yin points, apart from liver 13, so the yin are supporting the gathering in and the regeneration, and also the building up of the blood. Another point, I mentioned these points here on the penetrating vessel, I mentioned gathering in the abdominal muscles, but also some of you may have heard of this point, spleen 6. If we put our little finger on the tip of our ankle bone and then line up the rest of the fingers, it's under our index fingers, just under the tibia. But to be honest, it's a really powerful point. But if you're in that area of the inside of the leg and even the inside of the ankle, there are quite a few points in this area which are good for supporting the yin. But if you do know spleen 6, that's a good point. Another one is actually kidney 1, bubbling spring, ball of the foot. It's the most yin point in the body. So when we're sat on the ball, we're directly supporting the yin and we're receiving the yin energy from the earth. Another yin point which is really good for gathering in, heart protector 8. In many cultures we bring our hands together. That's the yin part of the hand, kind of like the yin part of the foot, and we can just bring it in to gather in. And so maybe that's a good way to end, with a gathering in. And so you can, if you're sitting on a ball, sit on a ball and gather in, or you might want to lie down as I did in the fetal position, curled on your side, or you might even want to lie down on your back or put your front down to really support the yin. And I'm just going to switch the view so that I come closer in to the screen to meditate, and to answer questions from those who are here with me tonight live. For those who are listening to the recording, I'm going to stop the recording in a moment. And so just take the time to also be gathering in. I think that's something that pretty much everyone in our culture needs, is more yin, more gathering in and building up, because we're a very yang culture. So if you just spend time gathering in for as long as you feel you need to, and resting. And if you're listening to the recording, if you do have any questions, if anything wasn't clear, please do make a note, make a comment in the comments box below with a question, and I'll answer it. If you're here now live, then I can answer some questions. So thank you everybody for spending this time with me, exploring the gifts and what can be some of the challenges of the menstrual cycle, and a little bit of understanding how it might express for men, especially if we think of things like transforming, releasing, nourishing, gathering in, manifesting.